Hey everybody, Zachary Mars here, and this is my presentation on 5 game industry technologies and how this tech will shape the future of gaming. Here we have our table of contents. You can see the 5 technologies that we're going to be covering today. First is motion performance capture, or Mocap. Virtual reality and haptic controls is next, followed by holograms, quantum computing, brain-computer interfaces, and timeline and analysis, which will wrap up the whole technology presentation and talk about some of the applications and how I believe this technology will evolve and unfold in the future. So, without further ado, we'll start with topic 1, Mocap. Here you see Terry Notary, a top mocap performer at work. Mocap has been widely used in the movie industry for a long time, actually also in the video game industry since the 90s. As early as 1989, the makers of Prince of Persia started using rotoscoping, which is very similar to what they use to do mocap, to take the real-life animated movements of the game maker's brother to put onto the Prince of Persia game character. So very early rendition of this in 1989 with some rotoscoping, but now we're seeing real mocap applications, especially since Lord of the Rings, with Andy Serkis and Golem kind of being like the real big project that pushed it into the forefront, that really made it a market viable technology, is what they accomplished with Golem and Lord of the Rings. Motion capture technology first began in Hollywood in the early 1990s, as I said. Started with crude sensor suits and evolved into real-time digital performance tracking. Today, they still use suits with markers, but there's also using machine learning. There are markerless mocap systems. So that's exciting. There's whole mocap systems that you don't need to have special markers, and it can still track your actors' movements and translate them into data that you can use to animate 3D CGI models. It's already market viable. It is widely used in the game industry and in the movie industry. Obviously, usually these mocap studios take quite a bit of budget. So I will say that most small indie game studios do not use mocap. It is becoming increasingly accessible. There are some kind of like home mocap systems. You could probably spend about $200 to $300 to get just one suit and some kind of rudimentary stuff to try to play with it. But for a real full production for a video game, it's pretty much exclusively in the AAA to AA game company area. But I'm hopeful that that'll start changing soon. Here you can see Shawn Ashmore and Dominic Monaghan at the mocap studio for the video game Quantum Break. Shawn Ashmore is a famous actor. He's been in The Rookie. He's done just a lot of stuff. Obviously, Quantum Break, the video game. But he had an interesting quote about working in with mocap, and I'd like to read that for you now. With motion capture, it's the actors, the director, the writer, and about a 50th of the crew. There are technicians working, but it's a tiny crew. There are way fewer distractions. You don't have to wait for lighting. You don't have to wait for props and things to be on set. So yeah, that's one of the great things about mocap, especially for video games, but also for film, is although mocap suits and studios can be expensive, the entire filming process is actually pretty lean. There's not a lot required. Like I said, they don't need props because those are all being added in CGI later. They don't need complex sets. They usually can use simple blocking and shapes to kind of represent the topology of the set, if you will, sort of the general shape of what they're going to be interacting with. But yeah, they can make really cool CGI animated scenes with very lean crews, and that's one of the great things about mocap. Shawn Ashmore also worked in X2, the X-Men movie, so he had experience doing mocap in both film and video games, which I think is really neat. Actually, a lot of motion capture actors and performers, they typically work in both. So back to our presentation. Mocap on technology curves. On the S-curve, mocap is at the very top or end of the S-curve, meaning it's at peak maturity. It's beginning to reach the peak of its capabilities, really. This is mocap's, I mean, I'm sure it can be refined in small ways, but it can capture such nuanced facial performances, body performances. With the advent of markerless mocap, I mean, there's really, I can't imagine it getting it too much more advanced, and it's just hitting this mass market. I think one of the only major expansions will be in the adoption curve, which is the next part. They will be breaking through to more users for sure. Yeah. So we'll see more indie game studios eventually adopting mocap as well as it becomes more affordable. Mocap is in the late majority phase of the adoption curve, with a large number of film game studio end users. And in the Gartner hype cycle, it is in the plateau of productivity. There's plenty of market viable products. There's realistic productive results from the use of the technology. There's no more inflated expectations. Mocap does exactly what we hope it does. It captures an actor's performance and translates that data into stuff that game studios and films can use to make really cool CGI scenes, to animate CGI characters, everything that's really important for especially high fidelity, but for even stylized cartoons and games and things like that. Talking about the value networks and domains of mocap. The value network is complex. It includes hardware suppliers for the cameras and sensors, system integrators for the software developers for mocap, data and rigging software that helps translate that mocap captured data, all the technicians and film adjacent people who help make the mocap studio operate, these technicians that they talked about, even the actors like Sean Ashmore would be part of the value network. And downstream, mocap is used both in film and video games. It has a wide use of applications. I'm actually sure it does other things as well. They probably use it in like scientific presentations and simulations, things like that. The domain is primarily includes computer animation, computer vision, entertainment, healthcare, automation, and engineering. Subdomains include optical tracking, so watching where your eyes are going, inertial sensing, sensing different forces that play in the scene. Markerless mocap, we've talked about a lot already, and advanced depth cameras that can really almost capture like more than just movements. You know what I mean? They can capture kind of like the difference between the space of my eye and my nose, things like that. So we moves on to the evolution of mocaps and my analysis of that technology and how it will be used in the game industry in the future. Each of my technologies in this report, I'm just going to lay it out right now, I found have evolved primarily through convergence, although there are some interesting examples of speciation after the technology evolved. But the main emergence of motion capture performance technology is a convergence of many technologies and advancements that happened at once, right? So we got advances in motion tracking, advances in machine learning, advances in optics that all came together to make motion capture possible. And that brings us on to topic 2, VR with haptic controls. Here we can see a Taekwondo athlete practicing Taekwondo in a VR simulator that's giving them instruction. And it also captures their movements. You can see there those knee and thigh, those little sensor markers. Those all help track the player's movements. Those are called haptic controls. Haptic controls are ways that allow users to kind of have a more textile way of interacting with the virtual world. So, if you get kicked in a simulation, let's say you failed to block in Taekwondo, you might feel a vibration on that part of your suit, just indicating to you that you got hit. It's not going to feel like you really got kicked, but it's going to kind of simulate some of the sensation without actually causing pain, but just like vibrations and things like that. VR with haptic controls. Until recently, VR was something of a niche product in the game industry. There have been a lot of weird kind of like, there's VR games and kind of experiences. You can probably see them at like arcades and things like that. And I'm sure very wealthy people do have VR headsets and play VR versions of Skyrim and things like that. But it's still kind of a novelty product. Most gamers do not play VR games or care about VR games. I feel like a lot of the control sensation not being up to speed keeps them from being more popular. Finding more nuanced haptic controls, especially for walking. I find walking in virtual games it's immersion breaking. It doesn't feel like walking. And when you make a person perceive a digital world in a headset, but they're using a controller to walk, it doesn't feel immersive. It almost eliminates the point. Anyway, aside from headsets, which make immersive visual in-game world haptic controls, such as paddles, exosuits, and things like this little Wolverine claw you see here that gives you the sense of grasping a cylinder. All these are, they're in use right now. There's VR suits you can get that can kind of give you that feel. They have these meshes that kind of allow the haptic feedback, things like that. And we'll go on to talking about VR and haptic controls with haptic controls on various curves. You'll notice that in my first section of curves and my second section here on Mocap and on VR, I did this with the rest of these. I don't have the curves actually on the slide there, but I will be doing a combined version of these curves at the end of the report, just a little heads up. So you'll be able to visually see kind of where on the curve they fall and how they fall relative to the other technologies, which is going to be really important for the timeline breakdown. So just a heads up, I didn't put S curves, adoption curves, or Gartner hype cycles on each of these technology slides, just at the end. And on the adoption curve, the majority of VR users fall into the early adopters category. I would say that's definitely correct assessment I did there. Yeah, it's early adopters, people who are playing it, novelty, kind of niche market. It's on the market, it's viable, it's just not widely used, widely popular right now. There's still some advancements that need to be made. On the Gartner hype cycle, it's in the early on the slope of enlightenment. So it's past that trough of disillusionment. People are like, okay, like VR wasn't that great, especially after the 80s, I think is like, right? It was like really hyped up in the 80s and 90s. Then everyone kind of was like, well, it kind of sucks. Now it's kind of getting back to, well, actually, no, it's kind of being a real thing. Like this could be really good. It just needs more time. VR with haptic controls, value network, and domain. The upstream value network includes hardware manufacturers such as Texas Instruments, flexible circuit creators, electronic chip makers, the textile makers who make the ultra lightweight, breathable, conductive, smart fabrics for the haptic suits that again allow all that sensing of what's going on with your body, as well as the haptic feedback, which is really important to indicate things like touch, even not even just I was talking about getting hit, but even as something as like what, let's say you got stroked, someone touched your shoulder in the game, you might even be able to feel like a small sensation of that, which I think is really cool. It's kind of like if you've seen Ready Player One, they had that sort of suit he could have the sensual experience in. Those are starting to be a reality. They really are coming along. So that's interesting. VR headset, original manufacturers, VR application, and game developers, and obviously the end users, the game people who use VR with haptic suits. A lot of it is actually educational. That's one of the wider applications of seeing more outside of the game industry is sort of gamification of learning processes through VR. And also what's great is things like the travel industry. There are VR explorations of sites that would be prohibitable to visit, places in nature or even in space that are just too dangerous for a human to visit, or places that if a lot of human traffic came through it, it would ruin the history of the place. The just the foot traffic and the way people act could be very damaging, but instead they can experience these places and these things virtually, and I mean, I'm sure that's not going to be quite the same, but they can experience a depth and a level of it without being destructive. And also gaining access to it. I don't need to go to the bottom of the ocean. I don't need to be able to afford a submarine to see a virtual tour of the Mariana Trench, for example. So that's very exciting. Travel, education, aerospace. There's a lot of applications for VR and VR learning. And the gamification of VR for learning processes. VR with haptics is in the domain of human-computer interaction, HCI, and includes special computing, mechatronics, neurobiology, actuation and sensors, motion capture, biometric tracking, haptics, and they all come together. So we're even elements of like the Mocap suit, the first technology, that kind of converge with haptics and with biometrics and with all these sensors and these feedback systems to create sort of a motion capture in real time for video games. It's really incredible. So it's this kind of evolution and interconnected technology, which also shows science and promise for future convergence in new and different ways, which I'll also explore a little bit in my analysis. Anyway, as each of the technologies on this presentation, VR with haptics evolve through convergence, primarily through the intersection of distinct GPU rendering and spatial tracking chips with smart fabrics, wearable ergonomics, mechatronics, and like I said, those mocaps and visual sensory input systems. In the near future, even more senses like smell and taste could be simulated to incorporate into VR systems. They talked about the optical tracking, so not just your taste and your smell, but where you're looking. could be a signal given to a computer and used in a game or another device. And so these will create a new sense of realism in virtual reality, especially where you'll be able to have more of a sense of feeling things and being felt, more of a sense of real human world properties existing in a virtual space. And again, I doubt that for a long time they will be exactly like the real thing. You're not going to smell and it's going to smell perfect. You're not going to, have a perfect sensation of pain or touch and honestly, that's not really desirable. We don't want, if we could just remake the real world, why bother? It's already here. But the virtual world being more complex and more nuanced allows for new virtual experiences that are unprecedented, unlike anything we've ever seen before. So that's exciting, and that leads us into our third topic, holograms. At Consumer Electronics Show 2026, the world's most influential technology event ever, it's sort of the big technology announcement event, Razer announced a new holographic gaming agent that works off their Project Ava AI gaming assistant. It uses an anime hologram avatar that can be changed, and this avatar sits on your desktop in this little cylinder, and using a camera, it can respond to how you're playing the game, your posture, your mood, your fashion, and it also takes inputs from the game itself, and it can sit there like a little personal assistant and tell you how to play the game better, give you tips for how to sit better, how to get better ergonomics, how to get better results out of the game, maybe even tell you to touch grass sometimes. So it's kind of interesting the way the AI here has converged with holograms to make this product. But my presentation more here is just about the applications of hologram technology in games. So this Razer product is an interesting convergence of holograms with gaming AI. But holograms themselves are also an interesting result of convergence, which I'll touch on later. They've been widely used for a while now, but they're still, even more than VR, a very niche, nuanced product that's not quite as long in these cycles as these earlier technologies. Like Mocap's way ahead of the curve. We got VR kind of starting to come into its own. Well, holograms are still kind of sci-fi. They're there, they're cool. These Pepper Ghost holograms and projections on stage have been around for a while, but sort of these true holograms, these holograms that are in these containers and that can be interactable they're becoming increasingly more possible, more viable. Still breaking through that chasm, I think. But and I predict that they'll become market viable within the next few years. I would say within 2 to 3 years, holograms will start to be a realistic part of the gaming industry, and one that gets more designed and catered to. Combining with sensor and haptic controls, we'll be able to create interactive hologram experiences. Game rooms where instead of being immersed in a virtual reality headset, there's real holograms projected all around you, and you can kind of interact with those. Still a ways off from something like that, but it's a possibility. So, in terms of the S curve, holograms are a pacing technology in the growth phase. Holograms have not yet reached market maturity; they haven't, but they're starting to see wider use and show movement into the secondary phase of the technology lifecycle, getting out of that emerging technology. In the adoption curve, holograms and volumetric displays like these cylindrical ones are in the early adopters phase, and even earlier in the early adopters phase than VR and all that. It's still very, very niche and nuanced. I know there's some really cool, I give it for anyone who plays Dungeons and Dragons. There's virtual tabletops that you can kind of interact with, and kind of simpler games that have VR. You might have seen some at the arcade, there's that Flappy Tower game or whatever, Stacked Tower, where you can kind of interact with it in that pyramid, and it looks like a whole 3D thing. So these volumetric displays, that's what those are called, whether they're cylindrical or pyramid shaped. These volumetric displays allow holograms to kind of be in a contained game space and interacted with externally. I'm hopeful that it'll combine in more interesting and exciting ways in the future, but even those are really cool. Like I said, cool applications for tabletop games, card games, things like Magic the Gathering. Anyway, That brings us to the Gartner Hype Cycle. On the Gartner Hype Cycle, they're just getting past that trial of disillusionment. People are starting to realize that actually, holograms aren't just a niche. They're not just a nuance. They're not a flashy thing to throw on stage to get everyone's attention. They can have some real applications, and especially in gaming. But there needs to be some more advancements to make them more, more solid, more something. It's like the elements missing that makes them really super marketable and desirable for audiences. The value network of hologram technology includes upstream materials and components like optical glass, lasers, semiconductors, micro LEDs, spatial light modulators, and GPU manufacturers. A lot of it is used, just like in VR, in university settings, probably more in lab settings than in educational settings. So a lot of research and experimentation is going into this technology that's helping it advance. Game studios, CAD or computer assisted drafting software companies, and medical software developers are industries where they use holograms regularly. Entertainment companies and consumers of holographic entertainment are a large part of the user segment, but it's still it's a small segment at this point. The domain of holograms includes physics like optics, lasers, and wave optics, and photonics, computer science, computer graphics and machine learning, and image processing, computer vision, lasers, displays, and sensors, and microelectronics, all the things that make producing holographic images in space possible. Telecommunications, electrical engineering, everything that plays a role, all these technology domains that are part of the evolution and part of field that comprises holograms. Holograms are also have evolved primarily by convergence. Distinct technologies such as optics and photonics merged with computer graphics, machine learning, computer vision. Advancements in these domains happen synchronously to where they cross the threshold. And now holograms are becoming reality. They're becoming possible. This used to be the stuff of science fiction, stuff you would see in Star Wars with a little "Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi." But now it's going to be here. That's exciting. And again, market viable by the end of the year. That Razer product, I'm going to keep an eye on. My prediction is that they will go from a novel and interesting way to engage with 3D models into finding more creative ways that could make gaming a real game changer. New games that take advantage with interactions of hologram would feel even more science fiction. It would be thrilling for gamers to experience that. And theming a game that kind of takes advantage of the tactile feel and the aesthetic experience of seeing holograms will likely lead to a new game that's a cultural phenomenon. A game like that could be a hit. Could be like Pokemon Go. That brings us to our fourth technology, quantum computing. This is a digital art representation of the possibilities that quantum computing could unlock. So to explain a little bit about what is quantum computing, because quantum computing, it can sound a little nebulous. Like what does quantum mean? So this little graphic here, it helps explain it a lot. So in traditional computers, everything's written in binary. The machine interprets signals that are zeros and ones in sets of pattern called bytes, which are segments of zeros and ones. And each of these zeros and ones represents on or off. Basically, it's originally modeled off electrical circuits. If the circuit's connected and it's live with electricity, that's a 1, that's on. If it's disconnected, that's a 0. This is also true with molecular physics. If we have a downward spin, that's a 1. If we have an upward spin, that's a 0. But in quantum particles and quantum mechanics, there's not just 1 or 0. There is a third state that's viable through superposition that can be both true and false, 1 and 0, live and disconnected at the same time. This is how things like quantum pathfinding work. So there's a lot of interesting quantum physics and mechanics, but essentially that's the core thing to understand here is computers are designed around bits that are more like electric circuits. And quantum computing is designed around qubits, which are they have that third quantum state, and that allows for an incredible increase in processing.
things that would have taken normal computers that use bits and bytes eons, like an impossible amount of time to complete, can be completed in a reasonable, realistic amount of time with qubits, which is incredible. However, as we go further along this presentation, you may have noticed that things are kind of slipping more into futuristic technology. This is something that is still being developed and researched heavily, especially by companies like Google and IBM, who have a vested interest in quantum computing.
Yep. Like I said, those qubits enable quantum computers to solve complex problems that would take eons. For gaming, this would mean smarter and faster AI, infinitely complex game worlds, new mechanics, new nuanced ways, even more nuanced ways of interacting with it than just the physical controls. But the system would be able to process an incredible amount of data, that the world would be very interactive as well. So from our experience of it, it would be more in depth and more interesting, but it would also it would be enriched within the simulation itself. Another thing this would open up that is the possibility of like new graphics, new sensations. And sort of just like, I'll get a little bit more into my prediction, but basically it's going to create entire new game worlds that are way richer than anything we've ever experienced. So on the S-curves, quantum computing is very early and it's an emerging technology. It's still in the early, very flat part of the S-curve. In the adoption curve, the technology is also in the very early first part of the curve in the innovator segment. Like I mentioned, Google and IBM, those are hyperscalers. We've got national labs and large enterprises that run quantum computing as a service pilot programs. So right now it's everything's in pilot. Everything is, they're testing it, they're working on it. What's interesting is we've got, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in speciation, but we've got a bunch of different researchers finding a bunch of different means of producing a qubit that is usable for quantum computing. That's sort of the main problem that needs to be solved, is what is the best and most functional way to make a qubit that works in actual quantum computing. One of the big limitations right now, I will say, is heat. These systems get very hot. In order to run quantum computing, you need like liquid nitrogen cooling and things like that. So solving these heat issues with qubits and quantum computing is going to be key to this getting past the emerging technology phase. The Gartner hype cycle is particularly fascinating. Rather than being seen as in the innovation trigger phase, which you would expect since every other curve is in the very early part of the curve, quantum computing is currently at the peak of inflated expectations, and that's by the official Gartner hype cycle report. Although the technology is still in its infancy and not mature enough for broad use, there's many people who are seeing the possibility of quantum computing as being like a next level technology. Like this isn't just a minor innovation. This could change the entire way we process data and communicate as humans. Now, again, maybe that's me just speaking from the top of that peak of inflated expectations, but that's really where it's at. People are expecting great things, but they're not here yet. But the expectation for it is ahead of where the adoption is. The value network is made up of component suppliers, distribute dilution refrigerators, cryo CMOs, control electronics, photonic chip fabricators, lasers, optics, specialized cables, and shielding. All the components and devices that kind of go into making quantum computers, especially all those cooling systems. System integrators, platform builders like IBM, Google, IonQ, and Quantum. They're each developing their own qubit modality and for quantum computing. I talked about that a little bit, but they're each using a different substrate, which is really fascinating. On the software layer, there's Qiskit, Circuit, error mitigation software, and quantum classical algorithm framework developers that help make up sort of the software and the algorithm aspect of it. So beyond actually coming up with the qubit in the byte, the little piece of information that can have the quantum state, we need new systems and algorithms that can react to qubits and use qubits effectively. And so that's all part of the value network, is the people developing those things.
The customers right now are primarily laboratories, research labs, government defense and intelligence agencies. Financial services are actually interested in some of the things that qubits and quantum computing can offer. So some of the early adopters are actually financial services. So the domain of quantum computing includes obviously computer science, data science, telecommunications, advancements in physics, quantum mechanics, and things like that. All those domains come together to make quantum computing possible. Even things like sort of solving the material science problems aspect of it, the cooling and the temperature part of it. That's all part of the technology domain of quantum computing. Our final technology that I'd like to talk to breaches even a little bit further into that sci-fi sounding realm, this far out technology called brain-computer interfaces. I believe this picture is sort of a concept image as opposed to an actual working prototype, but it shows a woman controlling a drone using a brain-computer interface. So that's an interesting facet of it. Brain-computer interfaces have fascinating applications in the world of gaming, but they're also tied very closely to the world of robotics. These brain-computer interfaces are interfaces not just for controlling digital systems, but also for controlling robotics and mechatronics. UCLA professor Jacques Vidal coined the term brain-computer interface in 1973, and he's widely recognized as the inventor of BCIs in peer-reviewed articles. It's a technology that sends and receives signals between the brain and an external device, such as a computer or a drone, by collecting and interpreting brain signals and neurons and transmitting them to a device that interprets these signals and then outputs commands to the system. Active BCIs require the user to actively modulate their brain signals to interact with external devices. For example, a user imagining moving their arm to cause a robotic arm to move the same way, or similarly. An interesting connection to the game industry is that research has shown that gamification of this learning process of BCIs greatly improves the performance and the user experience of learning how to control with motor imagery. Here you can see a very early rendition of a BCI gaming setup. This person using brain signals to navigate a 3D world. BCI sits in the early growth inflection of the S-curve, technology that is just emerging and far, far, far away from maturing. In terms of the technology adoption curve, BCI is currently in the innovator segment, the very few actual market uses. Rather, it's something that's going through a lot of research and development. Labs are using it, educational centers, things like that, but it's a technology that is largely in development. In the Gartner hype cycle, it is still in the innovation trigger phase, unlike the technology we just talked about, the quantum computing. It's not in the peak of hyped expectations. There's not this overwhelming intrigue with brain-computer interfaces yet. So it's still something that's being explored. I think it has fascinating applications. But yeah, sort of a new technology. In terms of the adoption curve, it's in the innovator segment. There's very few actual market uses. And the Gartner hype cycle, it's still in the innovation trigger phase. Again, yeah, okay, so I already talked about that. But the innovation trigger phase, it just means that they're going through clinical validation, they're manufacturing scale, they're getting through regulations and ethical concerns with it. There's invasive and non-invasive BCI, so there's different elements to how this can sort of affect the users as well. So there's a lot of ethical concerns with translating brainwaves into real world things. So now we'll talk about a little bit about the value network in the domain. The value network runs from upstream component suppliers, electrodes, chips, biocompatible materials, academic research and development and IP holders, to the device makers who make invasive and non-invasive BCIs, alongside a fast-growing AI and software decoding layer that's increasingly where value is captured. So innovations in machine learning and AI are making these signals more usable and more trainable. And that's important because that's making BCI more viable. This connects to clinical and regular intermediaries like hospitals, the FDA, CROs, distribution channels like DTC, OEM licensing, medical, and ultimately the end users and payers, patients, insurance, healthcare systems, governments. I say patients because a lot of this is an accessibility feature. Most people can use game controllers and they like to, and that's fine. Most people could use like a VR suit and that's fine. However, there are people with conditions that would make that difficult. People who have paralysis or partial paralysis, various conditions that would make moving or controlling a haptic system or a physical system difficult. This sort of opens pathways for them. It allows them to play games they never would have been able to play before, experience things that they never would have been able to experience before. The domain, let's see, creates a direct link between neural activity and external devices. So we're talking about invasive, which are implanted BCIs, okay, used by companies like Neuralink, Synchron, and BlackRock Neurotech. Partially invasive, which are like surface electrodes, and completely non-invasive headsets that use AI-driven signal decoding layer to increase their performance. I talked about that a bit, the machine learning that can learn to translate the signals for you better. Core applications include medical clinical uses, paralysis, epilepsy, ALS, stroke rehabilitation. Like I said, people who lose motor function or have limited motor function, this can help them function in another way. Assistive communication, neurofeedback, wellness, gaming and AR, academic research, and emerging uses in cognitive augmentation, so making people smarter, and in defense. I can see very clear applications of having a soldier be able to control a drone with his brain. So yeah, there's some fascinating applications that are breaking out that are now part of this whole domain and also the value network of brain-computer interfaces. Just like all the other four technologies, it is a textbook case of convergence. Several independent fields of research matured on their own trajectories, including neuroscience, material science, signal processing, low-powered microelectronics, and robotics, crossing a threshold at the same time and independently enabling the creation of these headsets and these chips and these systems that use our brainwaves and translate them into usable data for systems. Within the gaming industry, the need to help and service game industry gamers with accessibility issues is huge. It's one of the biggest areas that I feel the game industry is lacking in, is finding good ways and good features that are accessible and usable to people who have conditions, limited sight, limited hearing, limited motor function, and opening up new possibilities and allowing them to use their mind to engage with the world rather than their body. It offers a way to bring countless existing games to these users. Furthermore, incorporating robotics and drones could find ways to make new games that involve controlling robots with our mind. Imagine BattleBots, but you're controlling your BattleBot right here. That would be fun. I believe we'll start to see more and more of this in the future. Probably not the near future, but maybe 5 to 10 years, 20 years out. That brings us to the final segment of my report. Yay! Timeline and analysis. And here's where we get to see all those nice graphs that I've been holding out on, all those S-curves, adoption curves, and Gartner hype cycle. So here we see the combined S-curve, starting with quantum computing, way just emerging. Brain controller interfaces coming out a little more. Holograms even higher on that S-curve. Nearing maturity but still in growth is all that VR and haptic system, and way out there, it's been in use in games forever, for a long time, for decades now, is all those Mocap and motion captured systems. Here on the adoption curve, you can see that BCI and quantum computing are both early innovators, which lines up with their S-curve. Early adopters are there for holograms, people who are buying that Razer hologram system, things like that. They're in the early adopters phase. VR is still an early adopters phase. I definitely said that earlier on too, but that's starting to break on into an early majority as more and more advancements and improvements in controls come along and make it more of a desirable system. And the late majority is Mocap. Everyone's using Mocap. It's probably going to continue to be used for a long time. But here in 10, 20 years, the people who just start using it are definitely going to be laggards. So right now, the main user base is in the late majority phase. And the Gartner hype cycle, which I think is one of the more interesting charts. It shows a breakdown where, like I said, that talk about BCIs, even though they're early on in the innovation trigger, you see the difference with quantum computing, that it's right there at the peak of inflated expectations. People think it's going to do amazing things, and I think it will too. Maybe not quite as amazing as they're imagining, and it may take longer than they're saying to get there. But it's coming along, and it's exciting, and it's making exciting advancements. Holograms are still in the trough of disillusionment. People don't really, they're not impressed. And, all the promises of holograms and these holographic stage performances, the excitement of that's kind of died. And we're not seeing anything particularly exciting to where everyone's rushing out to get a hologram. Even this Razer thing definitely feels like a novelty. It's cool. Don't get me wrong. It's very cool. But it's people aren't buying it, using it regularly for games yet. And that's okay. That's just where we're at right now. On the slope of enlightenment, you see VR and haptics are making their way up. They're starting to get towards the plateau of productivity where they can be really widely market used, massively popular VR games, online VR games, things like that. And Mocap is at the very end of the plateau of productivity. It's in full swing. It's been in use for a while. It's going to be in use for a long while still. So yeah, fully productive. Everyone's using Mocap, and I predict in the very near future, next few years, you'll see a lot more indie studios using it too. So here's sort of my next year, some of my predictions for the next year really, but an 8-year timeline of what's sort of going to be changing over the next few years with these technologies. So right now, this next year, Mocap's going to continue to dominate. We're going to see that as the most widely used technology. We're probably not going to see a whole lot more VR next year. A whole lot more advanced haptic controls or holographic systems or things like that immediately. It's still mostly going to be Mocap and really cool performance captures and good animations in games, and not quantum computing and controlling things with your mind yet. Year 2, we'll see VR with haptics becoming more widespread and more advanced. We'll see wider adoption. So I'm saying here in a couple years, we'll probably see more VR games instead of next year, but maybe 2028, things like that. We'll see more VR games that are better controls, more popular, more interesting. Year 3, we've got market viable hologram products becoming increasingly popular rather than just the little Razer desktop assistant. We might see some real game interfaces using volumetric displays. More advancements and larger volumetric displays being used and marketed and sold effectively. Year 4, we'll probably see more advancements in quantum computing, leading to quantum gaming, some of the first quantum games being fully released and market viable, probably about 4 years out from that. Year 5, gamers will complain about the quantum gaming being too chaotic because bits are reliable. Bits are easy to control. They're easy to program. They create a consistent experience. The problem with like large language model AI, same problem with quantum gaming, is that controlling quantum states and how that interacts with systems gets trickier and more complex. And right now, developing games is already an incredibly complex process. So I feel like gamers and developers in year 5 from now will start kind of backlashing a little bit on the quantum computing until it gets a little more refined and people start to understand and develop better systems for interacting with it. Year 6, we'll look at pilot BCI controllers being released to markets, targeting accessibility users. We'll probably see market BCI headsets, things like that end users and people can get outside of just being patients. I'll also see probably around the year 5 things like I was talking about, where you'll see drone or robot battles or games where people control machines with their mind as a game. Markerless Mocap will remove the need for Mocap suits entirely. And more importantly than that is by year 7, I believe that all indie game studios, pretty much anyone who wants to use Mocap is going to be using Mocaps. It's probably going to be even kind of coming into more of an evolution or a change into some other technology, but it will be very, very mature at that point, and it will be more affordable to where your mom and pop shop game studios will be able to use motion performance capture to create better games. Finally, year 8, we'll look at further convergence with these technologies, creating new gaming tech innovations, new interactive holographic virtual gaming. And so that's kind of my big prediction here, is by the next decade, maybe 2.5, we'll start to see things like the holodeck from Star Trek The Next Generation, where people can enter a virtual game space that projects holograms, that reacts to their thoughts, their movements, where they're looking in real time, and it doesn't feel like it's a computation. It feels like a real world. It feels like something you're interacting with. I know it really looks and feels like the stuff of sci-fi, but the exciting thing is, I believe in 20 to 30 years, it won't be. It'll be reality. And that could be in my lifetime. That's really exciting. So here's my final thoughts. How these technologies converge and fuse as they advance makes very exciting implications for the game industry. New games that exist in 3D, in real 3D space, or virtual worlds where entire societies exist and interact with online while using advanced game controls that were never possible before because of limitations of things like lag and network technology that will be overcome by the power of quantum computing. So quantum computing, brain controlling interfaces, holograms, haptic controls, and VR suits that allow deeper sensation in virtual worlds, and being able to translate all that and perform that data analysis in real time will create basically like a whole virtual universe, if you will, that players will be able to exist in, new content will be made in, and it will sort of shape and transform the world of gaming as we know it. That's many years away from now, many decades away from now, but I do believe that is around the corner. Really, I mean, that's in terms of decades, but still 20, 30 years, 40 years, we're going to have some really, really cool tech out there for gaming. Thanks for listening to my presentation. Here's some of my references and sources. I hope you enjoyed learning about game industry technology. Keep up with Finn's Fables on YouTube. Check out my new Japanese adventure game in development, Kintaro. And thanks for watching.